Story 1. The Locked Corridor. I used to work the night shift at an older condo tower in downtown Seattle, the kind of place where the outside looked polished and modern, but the bones of the building still belonged to another era. My official title was night concierge, but what I really did was monitor half-working security cameras and walk laps around a parking garage long after the rest of the city went to sleep. The building Harborview Residences had been thrown together in the late 70s when architects loved concrete and cared very little about how it aged. Over the decades, it had been renovated in scattered pieces, creating a patchwork interior full of odd angles and leftover rooms that no one used anymore. The garage was the worst part. 2 levels, both partially open to the street, full of blind spots that the camera system could never quite cover. Because of that, I had to patrol the entire garage twice a night. It wasn't optional. The association had too many break-ins over the years, so they wanted someone walking down every little aisle shining a flashlight into the corners where people like to hide. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid rent, and I learned the layout better than anyone else. One area, though, never felt right. On the lower level of the garage, tucked under the ramp that led up to the second floor, there was a metal door most people never noticed. Behind it was a narrow corridor that seemed to exist for no reason except to give maintenance access to a huge water pipe at the very end. The space stretched maybe 20 or 25 feet, no wider than a closet laid sideways. Concrete on all sides. No switches, no wiring, no vents. The most unsettling part was the door. From the outside, at chest height, there was a heavy sliding bolt, a thick metal latch that dropped into place with the kind of weight that suggested permanence. On the inside, there was nothing. No knob, no handle, no mechanism. If someone closed the door while you were inside, you stayed there. The first time I saw that, I felt a brief chill climb up the back of my neck. It wasn't fear of ghosts or anything paranormal. It was the simple, practical realization that a person could be sealed inside that hallway, and no amount of shouting would reach anyone through the concrete. I tried bringing it up to management, thinking maybe they'd overlooked how dangerous it was. Instead, they brushed it off, insisting that the space wasn't a concern, and that I simply needed to check it during rounds and move on. They sounded almost annoyed that I'd even bothered. After that conversation, there was nothing more I could do about it. The door stayed exactly as it was. So every night I'd open the door, shine my flashlight down the narrow corridor, confirm that it was empty, and then back away without stepping inside. I never crossed the threshold. Even when my rational mind told me it was fine, something deeper in my brain reminded me that the bolt was on the wrong side. For months, it became part of my routine, an unpleasant pit stop on a long, quiet shift. Then came that Wednesday night in early spring, a little after 3 in the morning. It had been raining steadily all evening, and the garage smelled faintly of wet asphalt. The cameras showed nothing unusual, and the building was as silent as a mausoleum. I remember feeling almost relaxed, the kind of easy confidence that comes from repetition. Halfway through my round, I heard a sharp metallic echo somewhere across the garage. A door had slammed shut with startling force. The sound bounced through the concrete like a gunshot. I paused, trying to pinpoint where it came from, but the acoustics down there made everything vague. I walked toward the noise, my steps echoing slightly out of sync with my heartbeat. The first thing I saw when I turned the corner was that the corridor door, the one I hated, was standing open. A thin rectangle of darkness gaped behind it. There was nobody around. No footsteps. No shadows moving between cars. No reason for the door to be open at all. I moved closer, scanning the garage as I approached. Still, nothing. When I reached the threshold, I angled my flashlight downward, expecting maybe a sleeping bag or some makeshift bedding like I'd seen in other corners of the garage. Instead, the only thing on the floor was a glass bottle lying on its side about 10 feet inside. It looked like someone had been drinking down there and left in a hurry. I imagined them hearing my footsteps or the garage door opening elsewhere and sprinting off into the night. The area had notorious blind spots, and people familiar with the building often used them to slip in and out unnoticed. Unfortunately, part of my job was removing trash. I didn't have the luxury of leaving the bottle there for morning staff. That meant stepping inside the corridor just far enough to grab it and get out. I stood there for a moment, trying to ignore the feeling that something about the situation was off. The air inside felt heavier, colder, as if the space held its breath. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that nothing had ever happened in that hallway except for my imagination running wild. I stepped inside. The corridor swallowed sound in a strange way. My footsteps seemed too soft, too distant, even though I could hear the rain dripping from the ramp overhead. My flashlight beam stretched flat across the concrete, the shadows shifting as I moved. When I crouched to pick up the bottle, the entire world snapped shut. The door behind me slammed with an explosive force that made my ears ring. Before I could even straighten up, I heard the bolt drop into place on the other side. Hard, final, immovable. I ran to the door instinctively and pressed my palms against the cold metal. Not even a muffled hint of the outside world seeped through. The corridor might as well have been a sealed tomb. My phone had no signal. The concrete and steel blocked everything. My radio emitted nothing but static. It didn't matter how loudly I shouted. I could feel the sound bouncing back at me rather than leaving the space. I wasn't alone in the building, but I might as well have been miles underground. After the initial panic, I forced myself to breathe slowly, but that did little to help. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, I heard something faint, a distant alarm, then another, then several overlapping car alarms. They wailed, ricocheted through the garage, then one by one fell silent. Not from timing out, but abruptly, as if someone had reached inside each vehicle and silenced them manually. I pictured people moving through the garage, smashing windows, stripping cars, taking whatever they wanted. They had known exactly where I'd be at that moment. Time blurred. I pounded on the door periodically until my hands ached. The darkness pressed against me each time I turned off my flashlight to save its battery, making me feel smaller and smaller, like the walls were leaning inward. When the bolt finally slid again softly this time, I didn't register it as real until the door eased open and a rectangle of fluorescent light spilled inside. A resident was heading to her car for an early commute. She stared at me confused as I stumbled out. The garage was a disaster. Broken glass everywhere. More than a dozen cars with smashed windows. Items pulled out and scattered. An entire crime scene created while I sat trapped only a few feet away, unable to stop any of it. Police were called. Reports were filed. Cameras revealed nothing useful. The thieves had moved perfectly through every blind spot. A week later, management dismissed me. They needed someone to blame, and I happened to be the most convenient option. Sometimes people ask if the corridor felt haunted, as if the story needs a paranormal twist. I never indulged that idea. There was nothing supernatural about that space. No ghost story lurking in the walls. The horror came from something far more ordinary, a door that locked from the outside, and people who knew exactly how to use it. Story 2. The Men in the Parking Lot. I took the night shift at a small gas station just outside Amarillo, Texas, during a summer when I had stepped away from college. The plan was simple: earn money, Avoid thinking about school and stay busy enough that the months wouldn't feel wasted. Working from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. seemed almost ideal. Most nights followed the same predictable rhythm, an early rush of customers heading home from late jobs or bars, followed by long silent hours when the world felt half asleep. The station sat alone off the highway, a tiny island of fluorescent light surrounded by empty fields and wind that never stopped blowing. The store was just big enough for 2 aisles of snacks, a drink cooler, and a counter with a view of the parking lot. Beyond that counter was the office, a cramped room with a desk, a safe, and a door that locked from the inside. If anything went wrong, that office was meant to be a little bunker. For the first hour of each shift, I always had a coworker with me. At midnight, they went home, leaving me alone with the night. I didn't mind. The quiet didn't bother me, and the monotony became almost soothing. On most nights, the scariest things I dealt with were raccoons circling the dumpsters or drunk tourists looking for cigarettes. There was, however, one rule I was warned about over and over: no alcohol sales between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. The county enforced it strictly, and anyone who broke the rule could lose their job immediately. I didn't think much of it. It was just another number on the clock. One Thursday night, things began as usual. My coworker left, I cleaned the counters, restocked the cooler, and watched the parking lot shimmer under the harsh white lights. The air outside was still and heavy, the kind of humidity that clings to you even indoors. Nothing about the night felt unusual. A little before 2 in the morning, a pickup truck pulled into a handicapped spot directly in front of the entrance. That alone was enough to put me on edge. The truck was lifted mud-caked and looked like it hadn't passed inspection in years. The man who stepped out had a shaved head and a collection of tattoos that looked more like warnings than art. Even before he entered the store, I felt the shift in the atmosphere, the air tightening just slightly, the way it does when trouble walks in early and you're forced to pretend you haven't noticed. He wandered the aisles, slowly picking things up, putting them back, glancing toward me through the shelves in a way that suggested calculation more than curiosity. Eventually, he came to the counter with a case of beer. By then, it was after 2. I followed the rule. I gave him the explanation I was required to give. I kept my voice polite and steady. It didn't matter. His entire demeanor sharpened like a blade turning toward me. His posture grew rigid. His expression hardened. Even from across the counter, I could feel the heat rolling off him. For a moment, I thought he might hit me, but instead he simply shifted into something more controlled, something far more dangerous. His movements became slower, his eyes calmer, but not in a reassuring way. It was the kind of calm that suggested a person who was choosing what to do with the anger they were holding. I tried to end the interaction quickly, but the man lingered near the door. Before I could plan a response, he stepped back out into the parking lot, propped open the tailgate of his truck, and cracked open a beer right there in the spot. I hoped he would leave after finishing it. Instead, another truck arrived. 2 men stepped out. A moment later, an SUV pulled in, then another car. Within minutes, 5 or 6 men were gathered in front of the store, shaved heads, matching symbols, inked on arms and necks clothes that suggested they had spilled out of a bar and decided the night wasn't over. They clustered around the first man's truck, drinking, smoking, tossing empty cans onto the pavement as though marking territory. Every few seconds, one of them would glance toward the glass door, smirking, watching me the way an animal watches something it hasn't decided whether to chase. The store, which moments earlier felt empty, now felt suffocating. I considered calling the police, but the thought of them seeing me through the window while I was on the phone made my stomach twist. I stayed behind the counter instead, pretending to check inventory. pretending the knot of men outside didn't intimidate me. The longer they stayed, the more their presence pressed inward, turning the store into a kind of trap. Cars that pulled into the lot turned around quickly, unwilling to approach the crowd. I saw one woman slow her car, take one look at the men, and speed away. Eventually, the first man came back inside. His steps were loose and unsteady, and his eyes had grown unfocused with alcohol. He placed another case of beer on the counter. His silence carried an unspoken expectation, an understanding that the situation had changed, and that I was outnumbered by men who were rapidly growing drunk and restless. There are moments in night shift jobs when instinct speaks louder than reason. In that moment, I knew that refusing would escalate everything. I wasn't thinking about rules or employment policies anymore. I was thinking about the men outside who kept staring in, about how far the nearest police station was, and about how long it would take someone to respond if something went wrong. The transaction felt like it took an hour, even though it lasted only seconds. The man left without acknowledging me, and cheers erupted from the group outside. They passed the new case around as if celebrating a victory. They lingered much longer than any of them should have. The noise grew louder, their movements more aggressive. They kicked empty cans across the pavement and shouted to one another, their laughter turning sharp. The parking lot became their territory, and I became an unwilling spectator trapped behind glass. At some point, after counting too many possibilities, I slipped away from the counter, locked the front door from the inside, and retreated into the office. My hands shook when I called the police. I wasn't even sure what I expected them to do. When a cruiser finally pulled into the lot, the officer stepped out and tried to break up the gathering. The men didn't move at first. Their voices rose, turning argumentative, and for a moment I braced myself for the sound of glass breaking or fists landing. Somehow the confrontation fizzled before reaching that point. They scattered, eventually climbing into their trucks and revving their engines angrily before roaring off into the dark highway. The officer waited until they were gone, then left as well. The silence afterward felt unnatural. The parking lot looked like the aftermath of a storm, cans everywhere. Cigarette butts, footprints stamped in spilled beer. I spent the next hour cleaning the mess while the lingering sense of danger refused to fade. The next morning, after a long and restless attempt at sleep, I quit. Not because of the job itself, but because of the thought that those men might return someday. They had seen my face. They had watched me through the glass like someone selecting an object. The store had felt small with them outside. The world itself felt smaller afterward. People sometimes ask whether night shift jobs are scary because of ghosts or paranormal stories. I always tell them the truth. The most frightening things I've ever experienced didn't involve anything supernatural. They involved real people, people who gather under fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning, with nothing to lose and no one around to stop them. Story 3. The photographer friend. When I worked as an overnight barista at a small independent cafe in Portland, I used to believe I understood what loneliness felt like. The cafe, called the Pine Light, sat on a corner between a row of old apartment buildings and a narrow street that emptied out completely after dark. It stayed open 24 hours a day from Thursday through Sunday to host late-night musicians, poets, art students, and anyone drifting between parties. By the time 2 or 3 in the morning arrived, the place became a dim, quiet shell filled only with the hum of the espresso machine and the whisper of steaming pipes cooling down. Most baristas hated the overnight shift. I didn't mind it because I was never technically alone. A friend of mine, Noah, often spent his nights there with me. He was a photographer, freelance, always working on projects that never seemed to reach completion. He brought his laptop, ordered beers off the clock, and kept me company while I cleaned the counters and reorganized the syrups. I felt safer with him around. Even the regulars joked that he knew the cafe better than half the employees. That summer, Noah disappeared for a couple days to attend a family wedding out of town. I worked the overnight shifts without him feeling slightly uneasy in a way I couldn't quite articulate. On those nights without him, the cafe felt larger, as if the silence expanded to fill every corner. Still, nothing unusual happened. A few customers drifted in during the early hours, most of them tired students trying to finish papers they'd postponed until the last minute. By Saturday night, fatigue had started settling into my bones. The cafe was unusually empty by 3 in the morning. I had received less than $10 in tips, and the streets outside were void of movement. I tried not to think about how the neighborhood looked so different at night, the way shadows stretched in unnatural shapes, or how the streetlights flickered just often enough to make the whole block feel unsettled. Around that time, I caught a glimpse of movement outside the front windows. A figure passed quickly across the glass, too fast for me to process who it was. I waited a moment, expecting the door to open, but no one stepped inside. I told myself it was nothing more than someone heading to the back entrance, so I went into the kitchen to fill a mop bucket. When I returned to the front of the cafe, the restroom light was on. I thought nothing of it at first, assuming someone had slipped in quietly. Yet something about the atmosphere felt wrong, like the air had thickened in the room. I paused behind the counter and listened to the building settle around me. The espresso machine clicked faintly as it cooled. The ice maker in the corner hummed. The wind outside brushed along the windows. Nothing else moved. A few seconds later, the restroom door opened and Noah stepped out into view. The feeling of relief that washed over me was immediate and overwhelming. After 2 nights of working alone, seeing a familiar face made the whole place feel warmer. He looked tired, still wearing the wrinkled suit he must have worn to the wedding. His hair was disheveled and his eyes were sunken like he hadn't slept in days. I assumed he had just returned to town and decided to stop by. I moved to prepare him a drink, falling back into the rhythm we'd practiced so many nights before. But while my hands worked automatically, something shifted in the air behind the counter. The cafe lights seemed dimmer, as if a layer of shadow had crept into the room. I turned to glance at him. In that moment, the entire world narrowed. His expression was different, not tired or dazed from travel, but something far more unsettling. His gaze was fixed hollow but intent, like someone watching prey rather than greeting a friend. The change was so stark that my body reacted before I had time to reason with myself. The back of my neck prickled, my stomach tightened. The cafe, once familiar and safe, suddenly felt like a stage with no exits. Noah stepped forward from the bathroom area, closing the distance between us with a slow, deliberate stride. His posture had shifted from the relaxed friend I knew to someone driven by a single, focused intention. It was the type of movement that didn't require words to communicate danger. It radiated from him in a way that made instinct override thought. My mind scrambled to interpret what I was seeing. The cafe was empty. The nighttime quiet had transformed into something oppressive. I became acutely aware that the front door could be locked easily from the inside, that the cameras placed around the cafe were ornamental, they didn't actually record anything, that no one walking by on the street would notice anything wrong at this hour. All the safety I had once felt with Noah in the room twisted into something cold. I backed toward the espresso machine, trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy even as fear spread through me. Noah's stare followed each of my movements, studying me with an intensity I had never seen in him before. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, his breathing heavier than seemed normal. The sense of threat was unmistakable. When he reached the edge of the counter, the space suddenly felt too small. I recognized then that waiting or reasoning would only make the situation worse. My eyes scanned the area for anything that could serve as a barrier, a tool, or a distraction. On the sandwich prep table was a panini press, heavy metal, always warm from constant use. Without giving myself time to doubt, I grabbed the machine with both hands. The motion felt fueled by pure survival rather than conscious choice. The weight of it surprised me, but adrenaline carried it upward and forward. The moment the panini press connected, the tension in the room fractured violently. Noah stumbled, slipping on the damp tile floor. I caught a flash of something sharp in his hand, a glint of metal, thin and reflective. My arm burned a second later. A shallow cut opened along my skin, warm blood spreading down my sleeve. I scrambled back, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. There was no time to question anything. I vaulted over the counter and ran straight through the kitchen, shoving open the back door and sprinting into the cool night air. My hands shook as I fumbled with my car keys, nearly dropping them twice, before climbing inside and locking the doors. My breath didn't slow until the engine started. Through the windshield, I saw Noah emerge from the cafe's rear entrance. His movements were frantic, as if desperation had overtaken whatever had driven him moments earlier. He approached my car, tried to force the door handles, hit the windows with his palm. The look in his eyes was something wild, something I couldn't recognize. Eventually, he gave up and fled into the darkness. The police arrived after I called for help, though the chaos had already ended. I explained everything in detail. My arm was wrapped. The cafe's fake cameras were acknowledged. A report was filed, but nothing felt resolved. Noah was arrested, later released on bail, and then simply disappeared. His social media accounts went silent. His apartment was emptied out within a week. None of his remaining relatives claimed to know where he had gone. It was as if he had folded himself out of existence. I kept working at the Pine Light for 2 more years, though the cafe eventually stopped staying open overnight. Customers later asked whether the building had ever felt haunted at night, whether I'd experienced anything paranormal during those long, quiet morning hours. I always answered honestly. The scariest thing that ever happened in that cafe had nothing to do with ghosts. It was the moment I realized the person I trusted most in that room had never truly been the person I thought he was. And the part of him I saw that night, the part that surfaced in the dim hours when the city slept, is still out there somewhere, moving through the world unseen. Story 4: The Hitchhiker in the Freezer. I worked the overnight shift at a diner off a lonely stretch of highway in Nevada, the kind of place where the interior lights never turned off, and the windows reflected your own face back at you long after midnight. The Silver Spoon Diner was open 24 hours every day, and at night it became a refuge for a strange mix of people: truckers, exhausted travelers, night drifters, and others who existed somewhere between the edges of society. By 4 in the morning, most nights had already emptied into silence. The diner sat a few hundred feet from an off-ramp surrounded by open desert. Nothing shielded it from the wind or the darkness. At night, the headlights of passing trucks were the only indication that the world outside hadn't ended. My co-worker Rick had been the overnight cook for nearly 15 years. He was the sort of man who could predict trouble long before it walked through the door. I trusted his instincts more than my own. If he tensed up, so did I. If he relaxed, the night usually stayed peaceful. One night, the quiet felt deeper than usual. The hum of the refrigerators and the distant whistle of the wind blended into a strange rhythmic drone. Only one customer sat in the corner booth, halfway through a plate of pancakes. Everything felt suspended in the kind of stillness that only occurs right before something breaks. A little after 4 in the morning, the diner door swung open abruptly. A man stumbled inside, disoriented and filthy, as if he had walked straight out of the desert. His jacket was torn so badly it barely clung to him, and his clothing was dusted with sand. His right arm was held awkwardly against his chest, as though he were trying to keep something from falling apart. Without a word or glance, he rushed past us and locked himself inside the men's restroom. At first, Rick and I assumed he was just another stranded traveler, maybe someone who'd been hitchhiking for days. But after the initial surprise faded, something about the situation began to feel wrong in a way that neither of us wanted to admit. There was panic in his movements, pure, instinctive panic, and the way he clutched his arm suggested real injury. I waited a moment before approaching the restroom. The diner was too quiet. Even the customer in the booth seemed to sense the wrongness in the air. The door was locked firmly from the inside, the light beneath it unmoving. I knocked not forcefully, but with enough pressure to show concern. There was a pause, long, cold, and unnatural. Then the faintest sound drifted through the door, breathing, staggered, and strained. It wasn't the breathing of someone gathering themselves. It was the breathing of someone terrified. I retrieved the master key from behind the counter. If the man needed medical help, we couldn't wait. But before I could get the key into the lock, everything shifted. The restroom fell silent, not naturally, but in a way that felt suddenly, unnervingly empty. When the door opened, the room behind it was spotless. No man, no blood, no footprints, no signs of panic. Just a perfectly clean restroom, so clean it looked freshly sanitized. The tile on the floor gleamed as though a layer of dust had never existed. Even the mirror seemed too bright, too reflective for 4 in the morning. It was wrong in a way that made every hair on my arms rise. I glanced at Rick. For the first time since I'd worked with him, he looked completely unprepared. He pushed past me and checked the women's restroom as well. It was just as empty. We stood there in the hallway, the diner lights humming above us, both trying to accept what we had just seen. Logic insisted the man must have slipped past us somehow, but the hallway had been empty and the door had never opened. Even the single customer in the corner booth remained seated, confused, unaware of anything odd. Before either of us could process further, something outside caught our attention. Through the front windows, beyond the glare of fluorescent light, stood the same man from the restroom. He was staring into the diner with a lifeless expression. His jacket hung open. Dirt coated his face. Blood streaked one side of his cheek. One of his eyes appeared swollen shut, while the other glimmered faintly with the distant light. And the way he held his injured arm twisted, hanging, barely attached, made my stomach twist. We stayed frozen, watching him as he slowly dragged himself across the front of the building. He didn't try to re-enter. He simply studied us through the glass with a hollow, almost pleading look. Then he moved out of sight, vanishing past the corner of the building. Seconds later, a violent crash erupted from the back of the diner. Rick and I ran toward the sound. The noise wasn't from the trash area or the loading door. It came from deeper inside, from the walk-in freezer. When Rick swung the freezer door open, the cold air spilled out in a thick plume. Inside, the man was standing hunched over, clutching handfuls of frozen burger patties pressed tightly to his mangled arm. He had torn open the cardboard boxes, scattering frozen meat across the metal floor. As he shifted his weight, the dim freezer light revealed the true extent of his injury. His wrist had been snapped completely, the hand dangling by a thin strip of skin and tendon. The twisted limb remained frozen in a rigid thumbs-up position, as though locked that way at the moment of impact. The sight of it, unnatural, grotesque, impossible, burned itself into my memory. For a moment, none of us moved. Then the man bolted from the freezer with inhuman speed, barreling past both of us. I stumbled backward as he collided with my shoulder. Rick yelled something unintelligible as the man sprinted toward the front entrance. He didn't slow, didn't look back. He simply crashed through the doors, vanished into the night, and dissolved into the empty desert beyond. We locked the diner after that, turned off the lights, stayed in the kitchen, barely speaking, listening to the silence of the building until the sun finally rose and the day shift arrived. As we stepped outside in the early morning light, a convoy of police cars and ambulances lined the off-ramp. A cluster of flashing lights illuminated something on the highway shoulder. When we asked one of the EMTs what had happened, he explained that a man had been struck in a hit-and-run sometime after midnight. The force of the impact had thrown his body off the road, leaving him undiscovered until sunrise. The description matched the man we had seen. Later, we learned one final detail: the victim had been hitchhiking when he died. One arm had been raised to flag down a ride at the exact moment he was hit. The hand was still frozen in that position when they found him. A perfect, tragic thumbs up. Long after that shift ended, I kept thinking about the diner lights, the glowing restroom, the freezer filled with cold air and scattered patties. People sometimes ask if the Silver Spoon was haunted. I don't know the answer, but I do know this. Some travelers never make it to their destination, and some stories don't end where the body is found. Story 5. The Halloween Prank. I worked as a nighttime janitor for a school district in a quiet town in Ohio, a job I chose because it allowed me to be alone for 8 hours straight. I wasn't antisocial exactly. I simply preferred silence to conversation and hallways to offices. Most people assumed the worst part of working nights in an empty school was cleaning up after hundreds of students. They were wrong. The hardest part was the isolation. A school at night becomes something else entirely, something that feels alive in a way no building should. My shift started at 8 in the evening, long after the last students had left, and ended at 5 in the morning. I swept, mopped, vacuumed, scrubbed bathrooms, disinfected desks, emptied trash cans, and polished doorknobs. The routine never changed. My co-worker, Mrs. Delgado, worked the other half of the building. We rarely spoke. We rarely saw each other. That suited me perfectly. The night after Halloween, however, came with an atmosphere I couldn't quite explain. Decorations still clung to the walls, paper skeletons, plastic spiders, fake cobwebs drooping from lockers. The remnants of sugar-fueled chaos lingered in the air. Normally, I played music quietly from my headphones to drown out the creaks and groans of the building. But that night, something beyond the music kept pulling my attention away. Every so often, even through the hum of my playlist, I sensed a faint disturbance. A sound just sharp enough to slip through the music, something like a quick footstep or a soft thud. I chalked it up to faculty members staying late, or perhaps my imagination working overtime after a long week. I didn't bother taking out my earbuds. I preferred not to know. An hour into my shift, I passed through one of the hallways I'd just mopped. The wet floor sign lay knocked over in the middle of a puddle. At first, I assumed I'd placed it poorly, and a draft had knocked it down. But then I noticed something else: small footprints stamped across the wet floor, appearing and vanishing in a short trail that led toward the stairwell. Children's footprints. The detail unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Students were long gone by 8. The school was locked. The alarm system was active at all exterior doors. There was no reason for anyone to be inside, except me and Mrs. Delgado. I set the sign upright and followed the prints to the bottom of the stairs. They faded halfway up, as if the feet creating them had dried while climbing. I climbed the stairs quickly, scanning each hallway but everything was still and silent. No movement, no stray student, nothing disturbed. It almost felt as if the building had inhaled and held its breath. I returned to my cleaning, trying to push away the discomfort tightening in my stomach. But the silence didn't return to normal. It felt expectant, like the school itself was waiting for something. A short while later, another sound echoed across the empty hallways, this time unmistakable. Running footsteps. Quick, light, rhythmic. They came from the second floor, traveled across the hall, and vanished before I reached the end. I stood completely still, holding my mop, listening for anything else. My heartbeat seemed louder than the school itself. When I went downstairs to refill my bucket, the scene that greeted me made my chest tighten. My mop bucket had been knocked over. The water had spread across the floor in a wide pool, glistening under the fluorescent lights. The wheels of the bucket were still faintly spinning, as though whatever had knocked it over had just slipped away. I mopped up the mess in silence, irritation blending with unease. I didn't want to believe someone was messing with me. The idea that a student had remained inside the building past closing seemed impossible, but the alternative explanations were worse. After finishing the cleanup, I decided to ask Mrs. Delgado if she had noticed anything strange. I found her halfway through disinfecting a science classroom, methodical and calm. She looked genuinely confused when I asked my question, but since we never exchanged many words, I couldn't tell if her confusion was real or simply her usual expression. I left without pressing the issue. The night continued, and I forced myself to push through the discomfort. For a time, nothing happened. But at exactly 11 o'clock, every light in the school shut off at once. The blackout lasted only a few seconds, but in that short time it felt as though the entire building shifted. When the emergency lights flickered on, the hallways glowed with a dim red hue that made every corner look sharper, deeper, more unnatural. Before I could regain my bearings, a scream cut through the building. The sound was unmistakable, pure panic, full of terror. It echoed through the hallways in a way that made the entire school feel cavernous. The scream belonged to Mrs. Delgado. I ran through the hall, heart pounding harder with every step. But I reached only the tail end of the echo. There was no second scream, no sounds after it. Only silence and the low vibration of emergency lights humming overhead. I decided the quickest way to restore the lights was through the electrical room. It was located beyond a short hallway where shadows seemed to crowd at the edges of the dim red glow. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. The darkness inside felt heavier than it should have. I pushed the door slowly, forcing my eyes to adjust. Something stood inside. A figure motionless, barely shaped in the shadows, blocking the electrical panels. My breath caught. Every instinct in my body urged me to back away. Before I could move, the figure rushed toward me. The door slammed shut with a force that pushed me back into the hall. I stumbled, catching myself only because my hand struck the wall. I ran, not toward an exit, not out of panic alone. I ran toward where I'd last heard Mrs. Delgado's voice. Even in my terror, some part of me refused to leave her alone. When I reached the hallway where she'd been working, her mop bucket sat in the middle of the floor, abandoned. The bathroom door nearby was open, puffs of cold air drifting from the tiled interior. But she was nowhere. The place felt empty in the way a room feels just after someone has left, still holding their presence, yet hollow. Then a soft sound drifted down the hallway. A child's laugh, high-pitched, muffled, echoing. Not a joyful laugh, but the kind that children use when they think they're hiding, when they believe their prank is working. I gripped my mop tightly, raising it slightly like a makeshift weapon. My breathing grew shallow. The red glow of the emergency lights pulsed against the walls. Even the air smelled wrong, stale, and metallic. I focused so intently on the far end of the hall that I didn't notice movement behind me until it was too late. A soft exhale brushed my ear. A presence leaned close. A whisper too faint to make out the words, but undeniably human slid across my skin. I spun around reflexively, thrusting the end of the mop handle with all the force my body could muster. It struck something solid. A body. A gasp followed, then the sound of someone collapsing onto the floor. My heart froze until my eyes adjusted. A student, pale, trembling, likely a ninth grader, knelt on the tile, clutching his chest where I'd hit him. Tears streamed down his face. His siblings, hidden in nearby lockers, emerged moments later, horrified and apologetic. They confessed everything. They had stayed after school to frighten the janitors as a post-Halloween prank, slipping into unused lockers and sneaking through unmonitored hallways. The blackout, the footsteps, the laughter, all of it had been orchestrated by 3 kids who thought they were being clever. Mrs. Delgado, it turned out, had screamed only because she had discovered the prank before I did. In her panic, she had fled unintentionally, leaving me in the dark with what I believed was something supernatural. The school district heard both sides. I wasn't fired, though I was reassigned to another school. The pranksters avoided expulsion, though their parents likely punished them far worse than any administrator could. Still, the memory lingered. Every night shift worker knows that empty buildings are dangerous, not because of ghosts or paranormal shadows, but because of the things we imagine when we're alone, and the people hiding where they shouldn't be. Even now, years later, I sometimes wonder if everything that happened that night was truly caused by those 3 kids. The blackout had been too perfectly timed. The presence in the electrical room had felt too heavy. And the whisper, so close, so cold, hadn't sounded like a prank at all. Some nights I still hear it when I walk down a quiet hallway. A breath, a whisper. A reminder that the line between human fear and something else is thinner than we want to believe.